Today, the beatings will continue until morale improves. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Tarric's back for another Friday afternoon conversation. Tarric, a lot to talk about. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, mate. And, we've only been off the air for, 2 weeks? And boy, has a lot happened since then.
Yeah, it does seem as though everything's in super fast time. But the other way of thinking about it is that things are spiraling round and round and round. I've got this vision of a plug hole, right? And we're sort of going round and round and round. As you go nearer the plug hole, it speeds up. I don't know whether that's a good analogy, but that's a bit how I feel at the moment.
Well, it certainly does feel like that. It feels like sort of the traditional ways of doing things are going out the window at a rather great rate of knots. If you look at, for example, what's going on in Venezuela, and then you just feel, you look at even some of the recent polling here in Australia, and it just seems like the sort of established order is just slowly, well, not slowly, but, increasingly crumbling in a lot of ways.
Well, some of the latest poll results, in particular in Australia, suggest that the major parties are just completely on the nose, and some of the minor parties are sort of bubbling up. It's happening also in other countries too. I think that the other observation, the latest inflation data, for example, that came out in the week, the sleeper here for the Australian situation is because of all that government meddling earlier on, it's now all unwinding. And so as you look ahead, we're going to see inflation continue to grind higher rather than lower because of what they did previously. So there's an issue where, you do an action at one point in time to try and solve one problem, which was try and get re-elected, but you then create a problem for yourself shortly after. I think you could argue the same for migration. You could argue the same for the first owner grant 5% deposits. Wherever you look, they throw mud at the wall trying to fix one thing and something else goes wrong in the process.
Well, it's certainly like that. I mean, with the latest inflation data showing inflation moderating from 3.8% down to 3.4% in headline terms, it's got a few people, saying, "Oh, look at, things are going to go back down. Things are going to go back down." But when you actually look at the data, more than 3/4 of that drop was just down to the fact of base effects from the electricity subsidies rolling on and off, based on exactly where they are in the cycle for each individual state, each individual territory, because all that matters. And then it obviously compares with where it was a year ago to arrive at the annual inflation figure. But looking at the numbers, it's going to re-accelerate, and possibly and then some later in the year, because I'm not sure if you saw it, but Westpac put out an analysis earlier in the week that they think that the unadjusted price of electricity, which doesn't factor in the subsidies, just a pure cost, that is going to go up fairly significantly like in the second half of this year, which combined with the fact that we're already seeing strong growth on the back of the unwinding of the various subsidies is really going to make inflation quite challenging later in the year. And a point that a former RBA economist made to the AFR, I think it was late last year, was that if you could screw with the CPI, and it will help you at first, because everything that's indexed to headline inflation, government payments, the cost of various different things, it helps. It helps the government, helps the bottom line, and it improves, the way everything looks. But the problem is as that reverses and as that unwinds, that then means that all the indexation that's going to get done in 2026 with that additional inflation pushed in by electricity subsidies are now going to be higher, which is going to push inflation even higher again. So it's really, really quite problematic. So, we just, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind.
Well, I think it shows you that the more you try and stick your finger into the system to try and sort of move the dial one way for one purpose, like I say, to get re-elected, it has unintended consequences. And unfortunately, it does seem to me that politicians seem to like to do things that create the announceables, the great news. And you saw Claire O'Neill's tweets, multiple tweets after the construction numbers came out, for example, right? Claiming, hey, everything's turning around. When you look at it closely, as we'll see later in some of your data, this is not really that good news at all in terms of how many things were actually approved versus not. And when you go back and compare it with history, or indeed compare it with where you need to be able to achieve that 1.2 million target, which you're never going to achieve anyway, you sort of have to think, well, they just throw stuff around and it's all about, political expediency, never mind what the real impact is, never mind what the truth is. And, we've discussed Spin Jim before. Well, he's still at it, of course, with the latest storyline too. So I sort of scratch my head a little bit thinking, well, when are politicians going to get serious and start to really truly address the issues that are on the minds of ordinary people? Because at the moment, they're just chalk and cheese.
They are. I mean, there was an article in the ABC today where Chalmers was talking about the birth rate, because the Centre for Population put out its latest forecasts, and basically the fertility rate and is in the toilet compared with where it should be. And he's going on about, oh, well, we're going to do more to be more pro-family. We're going to trot out more policies that make it easier for people to have children. But how can they do that? Housing prices and housing costs are at nosebleed levels, both heavily influenced by the policy choices that they have made since they came to power, particularly rents. And then you've got Claire O'Neill at the end of 2023, I believe it was 2020, the end of 2023, talking about the fact that the Albanese government doesn't want housing prices to fall, that it only wants ever-rising housing prices.
Sustainably rising.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, Martin. The thing is I contacted Claire O'Neill's office. I've contacted Albo. I've contacted both of them, and I also contacted their opposite numbers on the LNP side as well, for them to answer the question: what is a sustainable rate of house price rises? Where would you like housing prices to be? They didn't answer. Now, I'm just so I'm clear for those who may not be familiar, I did that in my capacity as a News Corp journalist for the biggest private news source in the country, and they did not think it was appropriate to provide me with an answer, despite the fact, I might add, that when I actually contact politicians and I ask them questions on these sorts of things, I actually go a step further than a lot of other journalists. If they provide me a full response, I will provide that response in full on Twitter, in writing, with a link on my article. And I also ask, is there a specific passage which you would like me to emphasize? So it's the pretty damn big free kicker I'm giving them, but they just don't want to take it. And I think it's because that they don't want to answer that question, because no matter what answer they give, someone's going to get annoyed.
Well, I can tell you that I was contacted by somebody from Claire O'Neill's office some time ago when that particular thing came out, because I quoted it verbatim, right, and said it's very interesting, that they're talking about sustainable price rises. And the chap wrote to me and said, you've misquoted what she said, despite the fact that I quoted her absolutely verbatim. And so they're very sensitive to this reporting, right? Because, it's not in line with what they want people to perceive them to have said. I don't know whether she deliberately said it or whether she misspoke or what, but they are trying to sort of, say, oh, no, nothing to see here. But it is fascinating. There is no way that I can see how prices can go higher and that be sustainable, based on everything I'm looking at in terms of the costs for people who are borrowing now, the costs of people trying to get into the market, the rental sector. On every front, house prices are too expensive. So I think we should come clean, and a bit like Canada and a bit like New Zealand, where things are changing now, we should come clean with people rather than actually just continue to paint over the cracks and say, well, that's fine. Prices can go even higher, which basically means you have to put even more of your income in to finding somewhere to live. And that, of course, continues to drag down the broader economy. These are so obvious observations. I don't understand why politicians are just somewhere over there.
Because I think the thing is that they don't want to confront that. They don't want to confront the challenges that a shift away from the housing price-led economy would necessitate. Like, I'll give you an interesting example. The other day, one of the issues, okay, I did an analysis the other day. I went through the national accounts and I basically wanted to determine how much of GDP was government and how much that has grown since Albo has come to power. So there's multiple different ways of doing that. Now, you can just take the numbers from the national accounts as they stand, which are then adjusted and deflated by very different deflators depending on what you're talking about. Some of them are deflated by, say, for example, government spending has a different deflator to household spending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you some quite different numbers. So what I did was I was like, well, okay, let's take that out of the equation. Let's purely look at it through the lens of the consumer price index, just headline inflation, which has admittedly been screwed with as well, which will flatter it just slightly. The conclusion that I came to was that if you deflate everything by the same rate of inflation, per capita non-government GDP has fallen over 10% since Albo got elected, which is just a truly striking figure. And I just find that just rather interesting. And even if you look at it just in per capita terms, using the government's own deflator, it's still down almost 4% in per capita working age terms. And these are really not great numbers. So it just goes to show that it's not about outcomes. It's not about improving people's lives. It's about politics. Because, perhaps once upon a time it was possible to achieve those sorts of positive outcomes. But these days, it's a whole lot harder.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting that this housing question, of course, is central not just in Australia, but it's in the UK. And in the US, it's interesting that Trump has announced $200 billion of purchases that Treasury are going to make to the mortgage bonds, right, to try and actually do something about the mortgage rate, despite the fact that it'll create more inflation later. And he's told a couple of the big investment companies that they can't buy individual homes for their investment portfolios, right? Intervention into the, quote, free markets. But you have to say again, that these are things which are actually there, designed specifically to be seen to be doing something, or at least talking about doing something, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And that, for me, is the archetypal problem. When politicians ultimately are doing and saying things for the sake of doing and saying things, rather than actually really wanting to tackle the root causes of the issues that they're actually facing, or not facing, depending on how you look at it, that's a real worry.
It is, and I think part of the problem is that we just go back to Australia for a moment. I think we as in the electorate have created a situation where small target opposition and small target government are very, very effective strategies. And when you've got mining boom after mining boom, or household debt after household debt boom, mostly tinkering around the edges and throwing out some tax cuts and stuff here and there, it can work fairly successfully. But in the last, just call it the year since the financial crisis, or perhaps more accurately, the year since the end of the post-financial crisis mining boom, things have gotten a whole lot harder, which has necessitated a lot of hard choices, but those choices haven't been made. Whether it's energy or housing policy, you name it, they've avoided making those hard calls because it's politically advantageous to do so. And then just to say later on, oh my God, what a mess, it's the other guy's fault. And that's, I think, where we're at now. And I think until vision starts being rewarded, and until truth starts being spoken, I fear that we are stuck on this particular path.
Well, and it goes back to the election cycle and, wanting to sort of get re-elected, and they'll do anything, say anything to get re-elected. Never mind whether it's the right strategic thing to do for the country. The next mob come in and then have the same imperative. So the imperatives around politics and what's important for the politicians is malaligned with the interests of ordinary people. I'm not sure how that gets fixed in the current, I suppose, news cycle, in the current social media driven environment, but there's a real big problem.
I think part of the solution has to be accountability from one's own side. Because the thing is that if you think about it purely from, the politician's perspective, the only time that they're ever held accountable by the entire electorate in completion, so to speak, is at the ballot box. You can screw things up catastrophically again and again and again. And as long as you've got the support of your party, you can keep doing that forever and ever. Until you're accountable to the public at the ballot box. So I think what we need more of is more people within their own parties saying, this is wrong, this is a mistake, and I think that that's something that we've really lacked in more recent times. Like, I understand that there is a need for unity in politics, but I think there's a greater need for accountability, for saying, okay, well, there we screwed up. And if the leadership needs to be pushed into that because their ego doesn't allow them to admit fault, then I think that's what needs to happen. And I think that's true of both sides, because I think that both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have displayed those kinds of tendencies where they avoid taking accountability for their mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting, if you take the recent Bondi Royal Commission saga, Albo went down one route and then ultimately had to react to the immense pressures to go in a different route, although whether the terms of reference are right is a different question. That was an example where he was actually forced to act because of the weight of opposition. But that doesn't happen that often.
No, you're absolutely right. And, and part of that was internal opposition from within Labor. I mean, there's reports in the AFR that it was over 100 figures within Labor who were, obviously fairly influential, personalities who helped push this in that direction. And still, I can't help but wonder that it's rather ironic that Albo makes the call on the Royal Commission the same day that the polling comes out that says that an overwhelming majority of Australians want one.
Yeah.
So, you're forced to ask yourself is, to what degree is this government by focus group? So.
Yeah, well, I've got a general message for ordinary politicians: is get a spine and start actually pushing a bit harder in the interest of ordinary people, because your leaders aren't doing it. It's a bit rubbish, really, at the moment. Well, let's get onto your slides, Tarric, because you've done some great work on these, and as normal, of course, you start with a cartoon, which is absolutely totally appropriate.
Unfortunately so, but it's one of those things where you got to have a laugh, don't you?
You do. That's so good.
Yeah. And as usual, the charts can be found at burnouteconomics.com. Big thank you to everyone who has become a paid subscriber recently. It has been absolutely great to see that number keep going up. So thank you very much, and we'll get straight into it. Now, this chart is from Shane Oliver at AMP, and I thought it was an interesting one to share, given that 2026 is the 60th anniversary of the 1966 census, which produced Australia's highest home ownership rate on record. Despite all of the tens of billions of dollars in intervention after intervention in favor of first home buyers, allegedly, we have a significantly lower home ownership rate today than we did in 1966, despite the fact that you've seen the enormous rise of women in the workplace, people getting more educated, housing getting more easy to build. I mean, in 1966, probably the most sophisticated things on most building sites was a hammer. So we've come a long way, but housing is harder now than it was then.
Yeah, and very interestingly, when you look at that chart, of course, that includes those with a mortgage and without a mortgage. If you were to subdivide that data point into the mortgaged or not, the other observation is home ownership rates are down, but the proportion with a mortgage is much, much higher than it used to be. So, it used to be roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but we've got now a higher proportion of people in the rental sector, a higher proportion of people with a mortgage or mortgages, and a lower proportion of people who own their property outright, which of course creates a whole lot of issues, particularly as you move into retirement. So not only is this in a situation where you've got two incomes rather than one income now supporting the mortgage, but there's policies over a couple of decades plus have actually taken us in completely the wrong direction in terms of home ownership, assuming, of course, that owning a home is a good thing. Now, I personally believe it is. There are people who say, no, that's an old-fashioned way of thinking. Renting is the right way to go. We want more people in the rental sector, and what we'll do is we'll bring the big corporates in. They can build more stuff quicker, and then we can rent it. Well, I'm not convinced that actually having a greater proportion of people in the rental sector is a great move, because as you move into retirement and your income tends to wane, if you're in the rental sector, you are forced then to continue to pay rent forever. And that's a real problem.
No, I agree. I mean, I think the thing is that if you had have asked people at, say, 2019, what do you think of renting? Then in a lot of places it was, I mean, don't get me wrong, it was still somewhat challenging, but in terms of the proportion of the median income dedicated to renting, it was technically achievable. I mean, that's something that's supported in your data, that rental stress was a hell of a lot lower back in 2019 than it is now. But if you look at it now, it's a whole lot more difficult. And I think there's also just there's a forgotten factor in the home ownership rate puzzle. And that is that the only when they calculate the home ownership rate, it's not done on a per person basis. It's done on a per household basis, right? Which can be problematic, because the thing is that if you're part of a cohort that never got to the point of making it to being an independent household, if you're in a share household or if you're still at home with your parents, you don't get counted. You're not part of the calculus in that. The person who is the head of the household is part of that calculus. And I did the math on this a while ago. There are about 350,000 fewer households today in the 25 to 34 age demographic than there would have been if ratios had continued at the rate in about 2004. So we are down about 350,000 households in that demographic alone. Now that filters through to the older demographics to a degree, but not anywhere near as significantly. But that then means if you then adjust home ownership rates by the number of people rather than the number of households, oh boy, it starts to get a whole lot uglier for those younger demographics. And things are already challenging enough as it is. And just one last interesting side note. If you look at the data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, it shows that about 95% of people, the next cohort to come after them in terms of age, starting with the elder boomers, the 1940s boomers, at the same time has a weaker rate of home ownership than the one that come before them, again and again and again and again, going all the way down to Gen Z. That's been happening for decades and decades and decades. And, as the boomers are passing through the demographic worm, so to speak, or the demographic snake is probably the better term, as they're passing through, because they had such great home ownership rates, as they pass, you're going to see a distortion in terms of the number of the rate of home ownership potentially dropping, because the people who came after them don't own as many homes. So it's going to be a really interesting one going forward, particularly with this year's census.
Well, it's interesting because I've decided to put a question in my surveys that started actually now in the new year, trying to get at this idea of multi-family modules within a household. Because I've got this hypothesis based actually on a few one-on-one conversations of we've got a greater proportion of people with a household with more modules of families in that household. If that's true, then that would support exactly what you're saying in terms of the true situation with regard to home ownership is a hell of a lot worse than what we're seeing from the official statistics that, as you say, just counts a household as a household.
Yeah, exactly. And I think part of the problem is that we ask because we lack the granular data on this, because some of the data series on this no longer get produced, or they've been produced so long ago that the next data set is TBA. It's a really bad blind spot for us, because unfortunately we don't know. It's very much based on these smaller surveys, these estimates, and they can be easily distorted. Like you look at something, say like household size, people say, oh, well, look at the fact that household size is falling. If household size is falling, how could we possibly have more group households? How could we possibly have more people stuck at home? And that's because of the rise of single person households. The inexorable rise of, it's over 1 in 4 households now only has a single occupant. I think it's up towards over 27% at this point. And that data is almost a year older now. So there's all these distortions and all these sort of aggregate numbers, and it really gets into like what you and I unfortunately probably talk about far too much, which is you got to go granular.
Well, yeah, big tick for that. We've played that granular bingo card again, which is great because it's totally true. But I would make the point that some of the very small sample surveys, 1,000 people that actually people trot out now quite regularly to try and validate a particular point of view, it's too small to get good data. It's too small to really be that useful unless you get a sizable. I mean, I've got a 0.5% sample, 52,000. That's a reasonable number to start looking at things. But if you want to go granular, you can't do it on 1,000. You need to actually have a bigger sample to start with, and that again is a problem because that's costly. The ABS don't seem to do it. They've given up on some of those really valuable data sets that they should be doing. And they prefer to actually now editorialize their. Did you see the latest CPI numbers? It was more editorial comment in the release than actually data this time around, which I thought was quite amusing.
It's a bit disappointing because I just feel like there's so much more we could be learning.
Yeah.
And I think that not only that, but it's so important for policymakers to have that data, to know what's going on, to be able to then influence policy and push things in the right direction. Or at the very least, if they're failing, then be held accountable, by the opposition or by the public to say, well, banging on their desk, this is what's what, this isn't going right, you need to fix it. Whereas instead we get this myopic focus on these headline numbers, which paint a decent enough picture rather than actually looking at the granular number. I mean, say for example, like, just what I was talking about before in terms of the non-government GDP issue. It's something that should be a focus. I mean, to be honest, perhaps it'll be like non-market jobs. There was that one report from ANZ, and then everyone jumped on it, myself included, admittedly. And we live in hope.
Well, hope isn't a strategy, unfortunately, but it is good to have some hope. And the critical point here is that unless you do have a good source of reliable independent data, then you've got no compass. And if you have no compass, you can say what you like because nobody can say, well, that direction isn't right or whatever, right? So, less data is actually more convenient for politicians. And the other point is that if you start getting good data that begins to all point in the same direction, for example, the housing conundrum, when you actually start looking at the data, you then build a case for doing something different from what you might be doing because the data is actually pointing in a different direction. So again, if you don't have the data in the first place, it's more convenient for politicians. So, I have a feeling that the reduction of funding to the ABS is a bit of a convenient truth for the politicians.
It's funny. Like I've been reading a lot of sort of papers and original documents, going back to the sort of the 50s through the 60s housing policy. What delivered that huge surge in home ownership. And I just find it funny because there's just so many gems in there, just so many good policies that we could be pursuing tomorrow that are just sitting there at the bottom of a dusty drawer that have just been abandoned because they're no longer politically convenient. Because we don't want higher home ownership rates. We don't want to fix these problems because if we start fixing these problems, that's going to mean that housing prices have gotten cheaper, that housing's gotten more accessible. And well, that's against the stated goals of the Albanese government. And, I'm yet to hear exactly what the coalition has to say on that subject for that matter as well.
Yeah, they've gone a bit silent, haven't they? Now, the other thing you've got a data on point here is on this issue of construction and particularly on the detached house approvals, which is a fascinating series.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting one because I saw, Claire O'Neill crowing about this on Twitter. So I thought, well, you know what? Let's look into this. Let's look into the numbers. So that's what I did. I looked at there's a Westpac survey from 2024, and it asks Australians, based on your circumstances, factoring in the costs and etc., what kind of house do you want to buy? And over 60% of respondents said they want a freestanding house. I think it was about another 24% or 25% wanted a detached house. Sorry, a townhouse. Then I thought, well, what other granular data is there out there? And I found a study from Statistics Canada, which was actually very, very good. And it asked both regular Canadians and also migrants, what sort of housing do they live in? And you know what they found? They found that migrants too. And Canada has a very, very similar demographic makeup of its migrants in terms of their places of origin as Australia. The majority of them want detached houses as well. So it's this really interesting conundrum whereby you've got all these people wanting houses, but if you go back and look at the data, approvals today are about 30,000 lower than the peak under the Whitlam government in the early 1970s. And to me, that's just nuts. This is not a positive figure. Although I will say, even though the figure is depressed compared with its historic norms or its historic peaks at the very least, it is still a hell of a lot higher than the Canadians, the Americans, and especially the Brits.
Yeah, very interesting. And it is fascinating, this dichotomy between what we are wanting to build from the government policy perspective, go high, high rise, increased density, and what most people actually want to live in, which is low rise, detached, bit of ground. It's hard to square that circle.
It is. And I think the thing is that, there are a lot of people out there who have these ideas about the way we should be living, about, these different movements of, we need densification, we need this, we need that. That's not how this works. It's not up to you. It's up to the Australian people to make that choice, for their will to be respected, and then for the government to pursue that choice to the best of their ability. That's how democracy functions. And I think that's a really, really big problem that we have, because the will of the Australian people is not being respected. You're talking about a system that is going to deliver, if traditional ratios hold true, that is going to deliver somewhere around about 100,000 new homes, 100,000 new detached houses, based on these sorts of numbers. And not only that, but 12% of those are going to be knocked down, rebuilds, or empty anyway. So you can knock all those off as well. So you get down more towards like 93,000 in total. And who misses out? Who misses out? Who says to the Australians or to the new migrants, no, you can't have that, because we have made a decision that is not the type of house that we are building. We are not pursuing the settings that are going to allow for you to have that, because we have chosen otherwise, and your opinion doesn't matter. And that's exactly what multiple governments from both Team Red and Team Blue have both effectively said to the Australian people through their actions. And I think that we really need to see the will of the people get respected, because Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party, once said that having that home and having your own little slice of land was the foundation of a sane society, that it was the foundation of family, of community, of nation. And now we have a set of settings where both Labor and the Liberal Party are pursuing an Australia that doesn't respect that very basic foundational ideal of the Australian people. And I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but that doesn't end well.
Well, it's very concerning also, of course, if you think about how long it takes to build a high rise. Okay, you can get multiple units once you've built it, but it can take 3 to 4 times longer than a low rise. And the other interesting observation is that the financing of one of those high-rise operations at the moment is very difficult, simply because of the economics of labour and also the economics of materials. So whilst they are trying to sort of move the approvals dial up for high-rise, it's very lumpy, of course, the high-rise, because if you have one high-rise approval, it could be for many units. So that's why it moves up and down all over the place. But the follow-through on that, so what's actually delivered in terms of actually a key in the door to actually open the door that you can go and live in, it's extremely slow. So that's going back to your productivity issue. It's actually significantly less productive to build high-rise than low-rise. So if you really wanted to solve this housing supply issue, you would be actually advocating for more low-rise, maybe spreading out a bit, etc. There's a bit of infrastructure that needs to be put in place, but that would be quicker rather than actually building up. And of course, the other thing about building up is you've got the risk of significant building defects, and of course the issue of strata fees, which is something else which, again, a lot of people are very nervous about because of history.
Well, I think there's also just the fact of, like, for people who perhaps aren't that affluent, who've just wanted to buy a property to have something to their name, people buying these apartments, and they end up in, in retirement having these strata fees that they can't afford, on a pension or on their super or whatever. And I think there's a lot there to unpack that hasn't really been considered through that particular lens. I mean, you even look at the various different estimators for how much cash you need in retirement. It's all based on owning your own home. And we don't, I mean, I've spoken to various people in this particular space, and we don't even have estimates on exactly what the average strata fees are. Like, it's all just very much, it's something over there. It's not something where we really have very good hard data on this. So you've got the government, pushing people in this direction in a fairly substantial way, and governments have been doing that for quite some time. But we don't even know what sort of world those people are going to face in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years when they retire, and then they have to confront living in a building of that age, which could potentially require, remediation works, and having to potentially pay that on an age pension or through their super. It's yet another challenging picture that I don't think has been appropriately assessed, but that's also not terribly surprising.
Well, I don't even know where strata fees would actually fit in the CPI calculation. I mean, indirectly in rentals, I suppose, but not directly.
Well, that's another interesting question as well. I mean, if you're talking, a lot of these strata fees are, sort of $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year, and that's it's not a small amount of money. If it's particularly for a sort of median earning household, you're talking about 5% of household income, based on the latest ANU data. So, it's a significant factor for those households in that particular space. So, and yeah, I think it is something that definitely needs to be investigated, both as part of the CPI and just more broadly, because the government is pushing this agenda quite hard.
No, it is absolutely. Well, again, it's another question that we should push the government on. Another one I guess we should push the government on is the GDP story, right? The real GDP. Oh dear, we are not going according to plan.
No, we are not. This chart that I have here is based on the 2002-2003 intergenerational report, which was produced by the Treasury for Peter Costello. And what it shows is where they thought in 2002, 2003, GDP per capita was going to go. And as you can see, reality has dramatically underperformed since just prior to the GFC. And it's not a pretty picture. I think that this is sort of indicative of what we've seen in Australia over the last almost 20 years, which is increase the population growth, And even if GDP per capita doesn't perform that well, because really it hasn't, it doesn't matter because we've got this other source of growth that's going to pad out the coffers at Treasury. It's going to make the headline GDP look decent enough, and well, who cares about it? Who cares about the people?
Big question. And it's interesting to note on that chart that there's a little bit of inflection around 2010. Remember that this was from 2002 data. So did they know what was coming in 2007, 2008? I don't know, but interesting little observation.
I think it's probably due to they were expecting productivity to drop somewhat, and I imagine that that's probably a significant part of it. Also, they were expecting a sort of continued deceleration in the birth rate, etc. So, but it's a rather interesting one because I just think that was their baseline. This wasn't a super duper, oh, this is going to go so well. This is our sort of extreme thing. This was just like, oh yeah, if things continue roughly about trend, this is about where we're going. And as you can see, up until around about the start of 2008 there, they were pretty on the money, to be completely fair to them. It's only since then that we've really started to see this major divergence. And, well, I'm sure that it will be debated exactly why that has occurred.
And it's worth just saying that on, I think, a previous show, we looked at the change in real disposable income. And there was a bit of a tweak around that same period. And it's continued to go in the wrong direction ever since. Costs of mortgages, of course, dropped when they cut interest rates, but the size of the mortgage went up. So the amount that households are paying for their accommodation started to grow as a share of their income significantly more around that same point. And as you say, productivity started to weep away as well. So all of those things came on top of each other, and we end up now in a situation where, in real terms, most people are still going backwards, unless you are in that few percent at the top who are doing really, really well. Politicians, of course, tend to be in that category quite often too. So maybe they're in the other side of the K and don't really care too much. But for ordinary people, that chart really does spell it out quite nicely, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I think you're right. I think that real household disposable income per capita, divided by the eras was just really illuminating as to how things are going. And I think it's just worth noting that if you look at the sort of granular breakdown of spending of different demographics over time, that you see this really sizable surge by people generally over the age of 55. And then you sort of factor that into the equation. And that basically means that the large majority of the people under 55 have to be going backwards because it's the only other way that the data adds up. And it's just a really disappointing state of affairs, I think, because I don't think it gets the airtime that it deserves. I mean, this is something that I've been hammering on about probably at least 2 years, probably more like 3 now, because since that some officials were kind enough to share the data with me, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But it is just disappointing, the fact that this isn't really given the attention it deserves. And I mean, I miss per capita Jim Chalmers, the one who used to put out press releases mocking Josh Frydenberg for using headline figures. And you know what? Per capita Jim Chalmers was absolutely right. But I'm really not a big fan of headline Jim Chalmers, the one who just does the exact same thing that Frydenberg did and Morrison did before him.
Well, maybe the problem is, I've got this theory that the Treasurer's desk is sitting on a large term table, right? And that desk is continuing to rotate all the time. And so they gain momentum as treasurers, which means that they become experts at spin, but not a lot else. That's my theory.
Well, if it's going around so fast, I'd be surprised if he could see straight.
Well, that case proved. Let's look at another really interesting little piece of data. Guess where some of the jobs growth is?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. This was put together by Alex Joyner, who is the chief economist of IFM Investors, and he shared this on Twitter. And what this shows is the number of people employed in the electricity supply subsector. And as you can see, since about the end of 2023, the number employed has absolutely skyrocketed. And this continues an uptrend that has been going in that direction since just prior to the GFC. And and naturally, this is a big, generally government-funded sector where there are yet more jobs created by taxpayer money. And I don't, given the fact that the renewables build out and the infrastructure build out is just really just starting to get into swing, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes even higher and higher again.
Now, we taxpayers, we continue to enable all of this to happen. You know, our taxpayer money goes and creates more government jobs and more government jobs and more government jobs. Not necessarily productive jobs, of course. And you got to ask the question, how much longer can we go on paying for ever more and ever more bigger government?
Indeed, and that's an interesting one because I've been going through the data comparing Australia with different nations. Now, I've done this before, but just more from the perspective of how much has it done so over the last couple of years, and then how much has it done so during the pandemic. And despite the fact that Canada is a rather giant country with at times, a rather disparate populace, similar to Australia, Australia is actually the one with the larger level of government relative to GDP. And I just think it's rather interesting that our level keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And as of the latest data, it's only the only time government as a percentage of GDP has been larger. And I'm talking about just day-to-day government spending, not including various government investments in infrastructure, etc., but just day-to-day government. It's only been larger in 2 quarters, Q2 and Q3 2020, the absolute height of the pandemic when the government was deploying the cash fire hose to the maximum. Yet in Canada, you started to see that stabilize and even start to pull back a little bit. Whereas in Australia, this keeps going up and up and up and up. And the question is, where does that end? How high can it go before government in general, whether it be councils, state government, federal government, finally says, no, look, we're tapped out. We can't afford it anymore. We need to pull back on this. Perhaps we need it, but we can't afford it anymore. And I think it's possible we may start to see something along those lines occur later this year, because I'm not sure if you saw it in the news late last year, but there was a rather public battle between Albo and the various health ministers of the various states, because Albo's saying to them, the hospitals are costing too much. And then the state health ministers are turning around and going, well, you gave us all these people. What do you expect? And that literally basically sums it up. You can, if you would like viewers, you can Google that. There's a quite good ABC article on that with quite a few quotes from some rather frustrated, shall we say, state health ministers.
Well, of course, the point is that government spending going up means it's got to be paid for. And that means, of course, that taxes continue to have to rise to be able to cover it. And the other issue is that with the higher interest rates and, bond yields in Australia are continuing to move differently from perhaps some other places around the world, it means that the cost of debt is continuing to rise. So you've got this spiral also happening where the cost of this strategy to the country is becoming unsustainable.
Yeah, I think honestly, given the current settings of the economy and the current settings of our politics, I think we've already passed that point. I don't think that under more normal circumstances that this is viable, because I think it's also just worth noting that the reason why the government has been able to spend so much, or just government in general, is because they've had extra revenue. It's a case of, they had a couple of years of, oh, look at all these extra people we didn't budget for.
Yes.
Oh, that's a lot of extra tax revenue, isn't it? And, there's been a couple of windfalls like that. There was the war in Ukraine, which delivered this enormous windfall in the form of excuse me, in the form of additional tax revenue to the treasury through the resources boom, and there's been all these various different factors, even just plain old bracket creep of just the government taking an extra slice because of inflation as the cost of living rises, and that's not sustainable in the long term. Now don't get me wrong, there are other governments in other parts of the world, say, for example, you look at the Nordic states, places like Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Yes, in those places, government is a whole heap bigger, taxes are a whole lot higher, but that is the natural nature of their system. Now, if you started screwing with it, like elbow screwing with ours, then you would start to encounter problems. And I think that's really where all this is going. But by the same token, let's just make, I just want to make one thing clear. If they want to be absolutely moronic, and I mean moronic, and run a deficit to the tune of 4 or 5% of GDP every year for the next decade at a federal level, they could, and we would still have one of the lower levels of lower levels of government debt in the Western world. So I'm not going to make the same mistake as previously, as I did during the pandemic. I'm not going to rule out any level of just insane stupidity.
No, they have still, quote, fiscal space if they chose. And that's the problem, of course. But it doesn't actually mean that it's well spent. And I've always had the issue about government spending. It's about the quality of the spend as well as the quantum of the spend. And unfortunately, sometimes I think the quality of the spend is the big question. But it is a very, very important point. And, when I look around and think about what they are throwing money at and what they're not throwing money at, I'm thinking maybe it's not even in the right places. But there you go. Now, just one quick other observation on this. If you look at the growth in tax take and compare it with the growth in take that households are paying for their mortgages, which of the two do you think has grown more in the last decade or so?
The last decade?
Hmm.
I would say probably I'd say the tax take.
Correct. The
Yeah.
astonishing observation is, despite all of the changes in interest rates in recent years, if you look at it in the round, it's cost Australians more through the tax system, through government strategy, than the RBA and interest rates in the round. It's a very interesting observation.
Oh, that is interesting. Disappointing, but interesting.
Worrying.
Yeah.
Here's another interesting observation.
Yes, this is another one from the old school intergenerational report from 2002, 2003. Now, one of the justifications made at the time for higher migration was the fact that they did not believe that the participation rate of older Australians would rise. They thought that it would remain roughly where it was at the time. And that was projected all the way out into the future, all the way out into what was then the 2050s. Except that isn't what has actually happened. It's actually been significantly higher. At some stages, almost 20 percentage points higher. And this has obviously transformed the outcomes. And I just think it's also just worth noting that in a vacuum, purely in a vacuum, this should have boosted real GDP per capita and its growth path above the intergenerational report's projections, which we saw in a couple of slides ago. But it hasn't. And it's also worth noting that if you go further down the age range for both men and women, that they anticipated significantly lower levels of participation rates. So they were preparing for this aging population and this population of people who were 60 to 69 years old who weren't in the workforce that never actually happened. And that's part of the reason why we are where we are today.
A couple of observations on that. The first, of course, is, well, partly it's because the health of older people generally has improved relative to the previous generations. I guess that's medicines and the other thing. But the other thing is that when you look at it, I see it in my surveys, there is a whole cohort of older households who still have mortgages and they still have very significant demands on their finances. So they actually can't afford to retire. They can't afford to come out of the workforce because of all the other things we've been talking about. So I think there are some push and some pull things that explain the differences. But I suppose it also shows you about the deficiencies of long-term planning when you actually say, well, we'll put that in and then we'll assume that it's going to go straight line into the future, right? Things happen.
One of the major issues with looking at it through this particular lens as well is, and as you say, with the issue of people carrying household debt, is that the data as we see it today for people who are age 60 to 64, these are people who generally or overwhelmingly bought their first home at a time when property prices were affordable. There isn't anyone in the 60 to 64 age demographic today who, at the average at least, bought their first home when it was unaffordable. So they got onto the equity gravy train before it started becoming a major issue. So that creates a situation where going into the future, what happens then? How many more people are going to have to be working later and later and later into retirement, whether they want to or not, simply because they've had to take on all that additional debt just to be able to afford a home? And not only that, but it also just looking at the say, for example, the AI question. Okay, let's leave, some of the sort of, it's going to make 10, 15% of people unemployed at the door. Let's say it's 3%, 5%, and it's concentrated in the people who are generally the least able to adapt to that in those various different white collar roles. And generally speaking, in a lot of cases, that is going to be older people. So what happens to them? What happens to the politics? What happens to the treasury? There's all these very, very challenging questions that I think need to be answered. And we're not talking about a huge, enormous, asteroid of an economic issue whacking into the country. We're talking about something that is, relatively speaking, a much smaller issue than a lot of people are anticipating. And let me put it this way: if we're only putting 3 to 5% of the people out of a job, I'm not even sure a lot of these AI companies are going to get to be profitable.
Well, there's a whole bunch of questions which we probably can't go into today, but the whole issue of AI and how it's going to impact jobs is pretty significant, I think, for some jobs, not all jobs. The other interesting observation is that as you have people who are thinking that they do want to actually ultimately retire, but they can't because of their financial position, and more of those are coming into the potentially hopper as the generations move forward. It's a big, interesting question about then who's going to pay for what, and it comes back to this question: does that mean the government has got to spend more on stuff? Does it mean that those who are in work have to actually pay even a higher proportion of their tax to support the people who aren't in work? And how's that all going to work? So these big multi-generational questions are still there, but I do think we need some more sophisticated modeling than the stuff that was done in 2002.
Yes, we do. Okay. Now, this is an interesting one from the ANU election study, which was released relatively recently. Now, they've been collecting data on this particular question since the 1990 election. And what they ask people is, do you think that the government, the federal government, will have a good effect or a bad effect on the economy going forward? And as you can see there, it's not very often that the people actually think that the government is going to have a positive impact on the economy. It's actually relatively rare. But what I think is interesting is that Australians don't have faith in net terms in the government delivering a positive effect for the economy.
Why am I not surprised? Because a lot of people know, intuitively they know how things are going and what isn't working, right? Despite what they might do at the ballot box. But when they're confronted at the ballot box with two different parties who look pretty much the same, or as we'll see from the polls, maybe other parties with a slightly different flavour, That's one thing. But when you actually talk about them in the everyday, our government's "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you" is not necessarily something that many people would would agree with.
No, no, and I think that's one of the problems going forward. Like, I mean, I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but even just from myself, like I see these policy, proposals that in the past I would have said, yeah, yeah, all right, that could work. But after you've been through the various data on how much all of this different stuff costs, all of a sudden you start to get a bit dark on it, to be completely honest with you. Like, you start looking at things and just going, oh, how much is this going to cost us? For example, like I was looking into the federal government childcare subsidies. How much is that costing at a per kid level, over time? And it's rising at something like the cost per child is rising at something like 3 times the rate of inflation on a per child basis. And this is before any of the major changes are coming through. So, I just wonder what's going to be the next white elephant, and naturally I can only speculate, on this, but I feel like a lot of other people will share that particular view, that it's just like, well, we're not really going anywhere good, anywhere fast, are we?
I would say we have a herd of white elephants, and probably one of the biggest is got a big NDIS label on the side, but there are many others.
Well, at least we've got a herd. At least they can keep each other company.
That's right. The trouble is they trample everything else as they go around.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, yes, and perhaps that's why we'll get to the next slide, why the government isn't doing so well.
Yeah.
Now, this poll from Demos AU is a striking one for several reasons. One, the government's primary vote has dropped below 30%. And two, perhaps more strikingly, the Liberal primary vote is now on par with One Nation at 23%. Now, this is from One Nation's perspective, this is brilliant because they're at, this is an all-time high for them at the polls. Whereas the Liberals, this is very much an all-time low. But in the next slide, there is something that I think is very interesting and not something that is commonly put out with these sorts of polls. What this shows is who people voted for last time. So, for example, at the top there, you've got people who voted for the ALP in 2025. And then in the bar below, that is who they plan on voting for now. So 77% of people who voted ALP in 2025 will vote ALP again. But 11% of them are going to vote for One Nation. But then you look at the Liberal Party and, oh boy, have they got problems. 31% of the people who voted for the Liberal Party in 2025 will now vote for One Nation. And that is a big problem for them. It is an existential problem for them because that would smack them quite hard in terms of the number of senators. And also just rather, frankly, almost insane statistic that came with this particular press release is, for the first time, a pollster did a two-party preferred number for not the ALP and the LNP, but One Nation and the government. And for the LNP versus Labor, it was 52-48 in favor of the government. But in terms of One Nation versus the government, it's 50-50. Now, that to me is just striking and kind of wacky. Now, that does come with an asterisk. It comes with this is very much experimental, treat with caution. But if that is even within yodeling distance of reality, that's deeply concerning for both the Liberals and the Labor Party, because Labor is geared up to fight one set, geared up to fight against the coalition. If they end up having to fight on multiple fronts and somehow that support ends up coalescing into different voting blocks which threaten them in their sort of what has become their more traditional areas, that could cause some real problems for them.
It's very interesting because it's a similar story in the UK where we've got Nigel Farage's party now very much dominating the agenda and dominating the polls, actually, because neither side of the mainstream politics in the UK is able to actually address any of the issues. And a lot of people are saying they're both as bad as each other. You know, Labour got in with a big majority, but now they're actually absolutely on the nose. The other side don't seem to know what they're doing. So people are almost in desperation grasping for alternatives. The trouble is that some of the alternatives that are out there and their policies are not necessarily truly formed, but they are quite popularist in terms of what they talk about. And given that, I think the next election round could be quite interesting in a number of countries.
Indeed. I mean, I think part of the issue is that One Nation has not historically been great at choosing candidates and then maintaining cohesion after those candidates get elected. You know, there are exceptions, like people like Malcolm Roberts who've stuck around for a long time, but then there's a whole heap of others who have, you know, shows they've gone off on side quests. And this isn't a problem that's unique to One Nation. This is a problem that other major parties have had. The Greens have had it with Jackie Lambie. Jackie Lambie. Jackie Lambie had it with Tammy Tyrell, and the Greens had it with, her name escapes me in this moment, but it's not an uncommon issue. And I think that's really Lydia Thorpe from the Greens. And that's I think one of the problems going forward, because let's say just magically that this sort of poll is realized in reality. Now we have absolutely just bugger all idea how the preferences are going to flow if that comes to fruition, because you're talking about a cohort of people, generally speaking, have never voted One Nation, and that would be the majority of One Nation voters. So working out exactly how the preferences are all going to flow on that would be a nightmare. Anthony Green would be glad he retired. But, you know, you've got that, you know, you've got that very, very sort of serious issue of just how all that works out. And not only that, but if One Nation did do well and they did get a bunch of MPs, how are they going to hold things together? What is that going to look like? And I maintain that looking at these numbers, this is very fertile ground for an upstart third party. Now, if I was a billionaire and I wanted to influence Australian politics, this would be the time. You create an upstart party with some good established figures, not necessarily politicians, but good established loyal figures. And who boy, under these conditions, focusing on the right issues, you could make some noise.
Good point. Well, we'll watch and see how that plays out. Now, as we come to the end of the show-ish, but before we finish, we must talk about Venezuela because, you know, that wasn't on my bingo card for the start of this year, but maybe it should have been. I mean, I know they were putting all the boats up there around Venezuela for some time. But boy, what's happening and what's happened is very significant and I think really important to understand.
Indeed. And we have entered the world of what some analysts are calling the done Road doctrine, the 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine, which was named after early 19th century US President James Monroe, who basically said, we don't want the European powers or anyone else screwing with the Americas. And for reasons that are rather complex and protracted, one of the biggest enforcers of the Monroe Doctrine was actually the British. So they got their way, despite the fact that, you know, a relatively green and, well, shall we say minimal in 1823 America wasn't exactly someone to go around smacking people about like they are today. But anyway, that is the lens that it's being seen through in the 21st century, that America is reasserting the Monroe Doctrine, that it is basically ensuring that there is no other major influence in the Americas aside from itself. You know, and it previously, Venezuela was very much a place that had, well, it was a big, China was a big supporter. China, you know, President Xi and the Chinese government loaned the Venezuelans over $100 billion. They're not getting that back. You know, it was also a place where the Russians had influence, where they would, at periodically at times base some of their large strategic bombers there. Now, that was, let's be honest, in a lot of cases, that was just a photo op, but it was still represented genuine influence in the region. And now, if, and it's a big if, that influence is gone and it is now, effectively an American satellite, that means that China is a big loser on this one because it's a big source of their oil. And they're a loser in the sense that they've lost their only influence in the region. Well, they're their main source of influence, shall we say. But anyway, I'm just going to get to the charts. On the left here, we have the world's largest oil reserves by nation. And as you can see, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. They have larger oil reserves than the Saudis. But this is where the but comes in. It is not, about 77% of it is heavy crude. Now, heavy crude is of such a viscosity that it is challenging to extract. Now, it is worth noting that heavy crude does have some very important applications. Say, for example, if you want to make asphalt or you want to make diesel, heavy crude is very, very handy, but it is difficult in terms of extraction. Now, on the right here, you have the current level of Venezuelan oil production. It's about 1 million barrels per day in 2024. Now, this is down from about 3.2 million barrels a day in the average in the 5 years to 2000. Now, this is where things get somewhat interesting. Well, very interesting in my opinion. What is America going to do with Venezuela? Is it going to... the US Secretary of the Interior and the US Secretary of Energy have both talked a big, big game on America securing resources for itself and for its allies going into the future. And one of the items on that list that they have rather publicly shared is oil. So the question is this about money? Is it about oil, or is it about influence over important, vital resources? So Trump has already said that the US government will support the US oil industry in rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Now, this is going to cost an ungodly amount of money. Estimates range from somewhere between about $10 billion US and about $60 billion US. And if you want to get it done faster, more again. Now, don't get me wrong, that is a lot of money, but it's also a lot of money for an income-generating asset and strategic influence. So there is a scenario, and natural justice scenario at this stage, in which the US rebuilds Venezuela's energy infrastructure, its oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and it uses that to leverage over the rest of the world. It uses that to open up strategic possibilities on places like Iran. It uses that to potentially suppress oil prices to hurt the Russians. It gives them a lot of geopolitical options they didn't have before. Now, don't get me wrong. As I said, it's going to cost a heap of money. But the question is are they willing to pay that, which is, let's be honest, less than 0.3% of US GDP, to screw with their rivals and secure their energy future?
Well, especially if they can generate revenue directly from the sales of the oil, which is what they were saying, right? So maybe it becomes almost a self-funding option.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, if they can even just get it to a point where for the government, it's revenue neutral, that would be a huge, huge win. Now, just before we get the comments, which people may have already typed, let's be honest, this isn't about morality, about what we think should or shouldn't happen. This is about what we think will or won't happen.
Yeah.
And just while we're on that, this is the last chart of the day. This shows where Venezuelans' crude oil exports flow. Now, I realize crude is spelled incorrectly, but that was the breaks. About 80% on average in the second half of this year's Venezuelan crude has flowed to China, either through official channels or through what's called the dark fleet and, generally speaking, sanctioned vessels, which are now being chased across the Atlantic by the US Navy and the US Coast Guard. So they're having a whole heap of fun with that. But this just goes to show that this is a significant loss for China. And also, if the US does manage to start transforming in Venezuela's oil production, and it doesn't intend to share that with China in the long run, those American options to screw the Iranians and the Russians all of a sudden start to look pretty ordinary from the Chinese perspective, because whatever hurts the Russians and the Iranians, while the US potentially supply the rest of its allies with oil, hurts China.
Yeah, I think this is a really big geopolitical issue. And of course, it's not limited to Venezuela. Potentially, we've got the Greenland axis there as well in the background as this new doctrine, or this reasserted doctrine of we want to control the Americas. But I would make two quick points. The first is that there was a photograph circulating just before the president of Venezuela got whipped away, with a bunch of Chinese people in a meeting in the country, right? Which sort of speaks volumes to this issue of that, there's a geopolitical link to China here. And the other is that this chasing around the dark fleet is a very significant issue in my view, because there's a lot of money being made by Russia, and potentially China's benefiting too, through those illicit quote unquote channels of oil. So there's a whole bunch of stakes upon stakes upon stakes, and I do find it quite interesting, I believe it to be true, that Trump might have shared more about these plans with the oil barons in the US than with his political colleagues. So it just shows you you couldn't make this stuff up, but it does raise a whole bunch of strategic, economic, geopolitical, and frankly, security issues, which I think just highlights just how, on the knife edge we are on so many fronts at the moment.
It is, and I think it's rather interesting because you just don't know where this is going. Like, there was an interesting tweet that one analyst put out that suggested that America could repurpose the tankers that it seizes as part of a US merchant marine. And I've just got this image of the US Navy rolling around the world like Admiral Cochrane from the Royal Navy's Age of Sail, just going around nicking ships because, I like the look of that one. We'll grab that. We've got a tanker, we've got a bulk carrier, we've got a container ship. Like, look at this. But, they were all sanctioned. They weren't meant to be doing that. And now they're ours. So deal with it. And I'm not going to lie, that I think that's something that would have kind of appealed to Trump. He does have that sort of robber baron persona that I think that he would rather like that sort of thing.
Yes. Well, I made a show the other day talking about imperialism is back in town, because that's what we've got here. We've got a whole different world order where effectively, there are a lot of European countries panicking a little bit, saying, well, hang on a moment, where do we stack up? Because basically I've got this mud map of the world, right? You've got the Americas centered around Trump. You've got Xi and China, in the Asia, and you've got Russia in the European theater. And it's like, well, the big guys, the powerful guys, they can assert their power and authority. And of course, of the three, well, Australia is almost nowhere, of course, but the US is right up there.
Well, that's going to be the interesting one for us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exactly where, like a lot of European nations are now being left with a choice of who do we back?
Correct.
It is that question of, both blocks. Do we side with the Chinese? Or do we side with the Americans? And, I think a lot of countries have liked having it both ways, particularly Australia in the post-Cold War era, because, everyone, it was the end of history. Everyone was just like, we are all moving towards liberal democracy and freedom and etc. And everyone will come to be like us, ergo there's no need to worry about geopolitical issues or the military or anything like that. And that's obviously proven to be completely and utterly wrong. But the question is what exactly is Australia going to do? What, when push comes to shove? And I think while the Democrats in the US may not support the way Trump went about this, the thing that pisses them off isn't the fact that Trump went in there and smacked Maduro over the head and dragged him back to America. They're pissed off that Trump didn't tell them and give them a say in it. That's the problem. It's not the fact that, I mean, it's not like they had a problem when they went in there and they smacked Saddam on the head, or when they went in there and they shot bin Laden. They don't care about America acting unilaterally. I mean, I remember one of the most popular times Trump was with Democrats during his first term is when he launched all those tomahawks at Syria. They love all that stuff, but it's about how he goes about it. And I think a lot of people just expect that once the Democrats back in the White House, that things are just going to go back to normal. They think that it's just going to be, oh, well, things are going to go back to how they were before. And that didn't happen with Biden. When Biden got elected, everyone was like, oh, we're going to see this big rapprochement with China. It's going to be great for Wall Street, blah, 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 blah. All these various tariffs, all these various trade barriers are all going to disappear. And they didn't. And I think as well as, what would you call them, as socioeconomic challenges continue to present themselves in the US, I think trying to sell something that's beneficial to China and potentially detrimental to America is going to be political kryptonite.
Well, it also just begs the question on AUKUS, doesn't it, with regard to Australia? And we continue to hand big checks over to the US on the promise of submarines that may or may not arrive. And in a way, it makes it even harder for Australia to say, well, no, we want to be independent, because we're not really independent. And we've still got this trading partner of China, but China is now being potentially, a bit miffed off with the US because of what the US is doing. Oh, gee, yes, complicated. Tarric, it's all complicated.
Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like AUKUS is a tribute. Not a tribute in the sort of, we're paying tribute to someone who's dearly departed, but tribute in the sense that you're paying a tithe to a monarch or
Yes.
or an empire, and because I'm not sure in the fast evolving world that AUKUS really makes a whole heap of sense, whether or not we're better off pursuing something that delivers something in the present and then reassess in the future, if that's perhaps the better option. But it does, however, keep the Americans on side, and I feel like in a lot of ways that is the more literal use of a tribute. And because the thing is, we've annoyed the crap out of the Americans over the years. I mean, when the Darwin port was sold to the Chinese aligned firm, apparently Obama flipped his lid. He literally allegedly rung up Turnbull and said, "What the hell are you doing? You could have at least told us you were doing this." And I think in a lot of ways, Australia has played both sides in this. China is Australia's biggest trading partner by a country mile. I'm pretty sure China is a bigger trading partner for Australia than the next 4 or 5 nations combined. So we've got this really sizable issue of our reliance on China, and that pisses the Americans off. They don't talk about it very much, but every now and then you'll get a leak from within the DC Beltway of, we're not liking this, guys. You guys are going to have to make a choice. And if the Europeans are being forced to make a choice, and their reliance on China is a fraction of ours, exactly how bad are we going to get bushwhacked when the time comes, when Trump decides that we haven't paid sufficient heed to the will of the US empire?
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid it is, power, raw power, and the application of that power, which we're now seeing, which of course is really defining, I think, this year. And I think the foundations of what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is now being questioned. And trying to sort that out at the same time of trying to think about the domestic issues in Australia. And as we said, the beating will continue because there's no evidence yet that the government is wanting to do anything other than actually perpetuate what they were doing previously. So very, very uncomfortable time. And I guess, my bottom line thought here is for ordinary people trying to get by, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of big issues out there, but I do think that we should still maintain some focus on the immediate questions about how to actually enable people to find their way and, be able to actually buy that house, et cetera, because just saying, oh, it's all too difficult, and there's too many complications isn't necessarily a good answer. But we are in very complex times, Tarric, very complex times.
Well, you know what? Perhaps someone should put together a paper for the Albanese government's Social Cohesion Royal Commission on how badly they are screwing up the social cohesion of this country by not allowing people to gain a stake in the nation, by not allowing them to create a life with a home, with work, with dignity, with a place for their family in the way that was valued quite rightly by all of the post-war governments. I would say probably up until at least 80s, probably the 1990s, until it became about, well, your house price has gone up. No one ever complained to me that their house price has gone up.
Well, of course, if you believe that success is measured by how much your house price has gone up, well, then they're actually ticking all the boxes. But as we've gone through today with all of the real data, the consequences are pretty difficult to cope with. We're creating a greater gradient for youngsters to try and get into the market, and that's having huge issues in terms of household formation, productivity, all of those things. And when you stand back and think about it, you've got to say, no, ever higher housing is not the way to govern a country.
No, and I think that this is something that with a lag is going to impact everyone in this country. It already is. And I think the longer this goes on, the worse damage it's going to do, the more it's going to bake in social issues, the more it's going to bake in economic problems, because we're not going to be able, you're going to reach a point in the future where so much capital and so much income is focused just on securing housing that it's just going to kill the economy. And in a lot of ways, it arguably already has. The next couple of years, particularly when interest rates stabilize, it is going to be really, really interesting, because once that headwind is removed from the consumer in terms of its rather than the flow, rather than the stock, if you get what I'm saying, that is going to be key in seeing exactly how things are going for the consumer economy underneath it all, because I suspect that we're not going to be able to run it on wealthy people over the age of 55 forever.
No, I think that's a very good point, and it begs a whole bunch of questions, doesn't it, Tarric? Well, I want to say thank you very much for a very potent conversation today. I think we've touched a very significant set of issues, and I look forward to having another go on a couple of weeks or so, or whatever, when we can next do it. But meantime, thank you very much, and have a good weekend.
Same to you too, and to the viewers. Thanks for watching.
See you next time.